All right. Hey, everybody. This is Katey Schultz on the Putting It Into Practice blog. I've got Charlie Sherpa here with us today. He is a poet and blogger and writer and journalist. His real name is Randy Brown, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about that in a second. We met several years ago at South Dakota State University at a writing conference along the themes of military writing and forged a connection there in person and have stayed in touch ever since. If you are looking for places to submit your war-themed writing, or if you know of veteran writers or military family writers looking for news, contacts, resources, and publishing opportunities, definitely go to Red Bull Rising to learn more from what Randy has to say. But today we are talking about his book, Welcome to FOB Haiku, which I can't recommend highly enough. War Poems from Inside the Wire. So this has a glossary in it, which is awesome and more valuable than you might imagine. Not enough contemporary war lit books have that. Before I give too much away, I just want to give a little intro, and then we'll let Randy take over. Freelance writer and citizen soldier by day, and secret blogger writing as Charlie Sherpa by night, Randy Brown was preparing in 2010 to deploy as the sole knowledge manager for an Iowa Army National Guard unit of 3,000 soldiers. After a paperwork snafu dropped him off the list, he retired with 20 years of military service and a previous deployment. Brown then went to Afghanistan anyway, embedding with his former colleagues as a civilian journalist. So his book of poetry tells the story before, during, and after of that, with many surprises in between. And I wanted to start just by asking you, Randy, to tell us about what inspired FOB Haiku, a little bit of the journey to get there. You said you didn't identify as a poet until it came out, so I'm sure you...
Well, exactly. I'm a newspaper journalist by trade, a newspaper and magazine journalist. I've edited metro newspapers, community newspapers, also trade and consumer magazines. Probably the biggest one that you might know is one that had to do with making your homes and gardens better. I come from a very how-to service journalism background. In the Army, I was trained to deal with digital telephones and computers. And then I found myself working in this strange area, and I saw that you gave me air quotes, which is a great thing, knowledge management. Basically trying to figure out who knows what and how we can let everybody know things better. So I continue to find myself as a nonfiction guy, even though I do joke, as I'm sure I've joked with you before, that I finally found a vocation that pays less than newspaper journalism as a military poet. So,
Nice.
That said, I continue to work on the work that started all this. Red Bull Rising came from my desire to document my family's journey as we prepared to have me go to Afghanistan and deploy there for a year in the largest deployment of Iowa National Guardsmen, men and women, to Afghanistan in 2010. We had known about that deployment since about 2008. So it was a real roller coaster when just a couple of days before deployment, paperwork showed up that said that I couldn't deploy. So my wife was a good sport, and I promised my friends that I would go ahead and visit them in Afghanistan anyway. And I embedded with my old unit for a couple of weeks in 2011, visiting them as a blogger or a journalist. So that story, I continue to write as both Randy Brown, journalist, and Charlie Sherpa, blogger, and I have yet to crack the code completely on that manuscript, but it's almost there, I promise.
Nice.
That along the way, I had gone to a couple of writers' workshops specifically targeting veterans or military family members. And often those workshops tend to get couched in terms of therapeutic writing or writing for therapy. We can talk about that later if you want, but this one was a good mix of writing as therapy and writing as literature. Because, some of us there, knew our way around a and wanted to find new ways of telling stories. And so there were workshops on things like visual art. There was a dance and movement section, and there was one on poetry. And I hadn't written poetry since maybe high school or maybe college. And there was a 10-minute writing prompt or break with a 10-minute prompt. And suddenly something that I had been struggling with from being in Afghanistan and trying to figure out what something meant, I suddenly had this poem emerge from me and onto the page, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with that poem. So I kept it for weeks or months or whatever, and started, as a journalist, I submit things for publication, so I started doing that with poetry as well. And then fast forward a couple of years, and suddenly I'm not submitting poems to journals, but I'm submitting chapbook manuscripts and even getting to the page count worthy of a full-on poetry manuscript. And I'm submitting those to presses, and I'm getting some very good feedback from those submissions, but publishers aren't quite sure how this whole thing comes together, as because I'm writing from a couple of different perspectives that aren't typically celebrated in the mainstream media. So I'm not a frontline soldier. I'm not a sniper. I'm not an aviator. Instead, I'm this strange mix of journalist and knowledge manager and citizen soldier, and what does that all mean? And the epiphany that occurred when I realized that my page count had gotten to the point where I should see what happened when I put some of my published and unpublished poems into a manuscript, was that there seemed to be an arc there. There seemed to be a beginning, middle, end there. And that beginning, middle, end was kind of Randy's or Sherpa's career. And while I define myself as a nonfiction guy, I thought it interesting that some of my poems are definitely written from points of view that I certainly have never been there, done that. I've never been a drill sergeant. One of my poems is written as a drill sergeant. I've never been a drone operator, but some of my poems are written there. So again, I'm coming up to the precipice. Where does that nonfiction to fiction boundary lie? But anyway, back to your original point. The surprise, the epiphany for me there was, hey, there's an arc here, and people getting that arc as they read and review the book.
Yeah, so. Awesome. Thank you. So it's over 90 pages. Many of them, I couldn't even count how many have already been published, and a majority of those published ones are anthologized, and it has a glossary. I didn't ask you this in email, but maybe I'll just throw this at you as a surprise, because you just mentioned the drone. Do you have a copy handy there that you'd be willing to read Love Note from a Drone on page 36?
I can. Thank you for having the page number handy.
The other one I had flagged was Grace Ready to Eat, but if I had to choose, I'd love to hear the drone one.
Excellent. Certainly. Love Note from a Drone. I had been watching you for days, fingers hovering above the button, waiting for release. I'm sorry I crashed your wedding. Ancient shepherds also feared impulses of distant gods who, capricious and vain, cast thunderous judgments in spasms of lightning, just as a praying mantis bites off the head of her mate at the moment of crisis. We will always share these points in time, the trigger pull, the black and white flash, your instant of recognition, my bolt from the blue. But only my driver will remember us together, suddenly and often, as he speeds along straight lines of highway, cutting through cornfields near his Missouri home, under cloudless, lapless skies.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't get a chance to read my poetry aloud enough.
Oh, yeah. I love that. So the next question I have here for you is, I'm curious about what one of the most surprising things you've learned about the war literature community of writers and readers is. You and I cross paths on that, or within that community, and I've learned a lot, but I want to hear maybe just one thing from you that you thought, wow.
Well, and you did, at that time, you did a great job in unlocking for me that everybody has a military experience, even if you're not in the military. And certainly in the veterans community, we feel that when, people who have been part of the military, or maybe their grandfather or grandmother was somehow related to the military, but every citizen has a stake in what his or her military does. As a voter, as a taxpayer, as just a member of the community. And of course, coming from a National Guard background, those community ties are perhaps even stronger and more readily apparent. So given that kind of background, it is also interesting to me how people regard the word veteran or the identity of veteran oftentimes as, well, all veterans are broken, or all veterans have had some sort of traumatic experience, or they begin to stereotype what a veteran is. We do it to ourselves. When somebody drives up and parks in the veterans only parking space, and she gets out, and everybody's surprised that what is this woman doing parking in this veteran? Well, it could be that she's a former sailor, and just like you and me, she served as well. With those concepts of veterans and service and sacrifices that are made in one's service, there does grow that idea that, well, anything that is labeled as a veteran writing must somehow be coming from a perception of a traumatic experience. And certainly those stories are there, and they're valid, and they need to be told. But not every piece of writing is necessary. If coming from a veteran is necessarily coming from that place, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So the surprise to me is then trying to navigate those spaces. I'm the current poetry editor of the journal As You Were for Military Experience in the Arts. And that nonprofit really tries to take the beginning writer, both the beginning and the expert writer or the experienced writer, but really tries to help almost create a virtual workshop for those people just starting out. So we do tend to work within that spectrum of, there's that writing about an experience to get it out and to work with it and to figure out what I think about it and feel about it. I would call that writing for myself, or writing for yourself. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum is there's writing for other people. There's writing for posterity. There's writing for an audience. And that's the more literary side. And we do try to then grow writers, from one experience to the other. So having that breadth and that spectrum of possible experiences there, I think is probably the most surprising thing to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Shout out to Military Experience in the Arts, another really great website affiliated with tons of publications and learning opportunities. And they have a great blog too, that I think I guest blogged for them once or twice, but mostly I just hang out and I lurk and read and see what awesome things people are posting.
Excellent.
So I like to ask everyone that I interview to share a tiny moment, there's your air quotes, with me. The tiny moment is a phrase that I was using to describe my own work before I realized there was this thing called flash fiction or flash nonfiction, but a snapshot, a moment in time, and specifically where you had a before and an after, or that you were or thought or saw something this way before, and then after it was another way. And I just wondered if there was a tiny moment from your life that you wanted to briefly share with us in flash form.
Well, that's let me build on something that I mentioned earlier. The idea that I typically have found poetry as a means of really kind of regarding a fragment of experience, something that I haven't been able to build out into a full essay, even a short like flash essay. I've got a friend, Jason Poudrier, who is a veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, and a poet. His collection is called Red Fields, and he says that it's helped him deal with PTSD to be able to take a memory, look at it really intently, deal with it poetically, and kind of expand and figure out what it all means to him. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned earlier the fact that I had embedded in Afghanistan in 2011. I spent a couple $1,000s on airline tickets and body armor and all this stuff, chartered a flight directly into Bagram Airfield, where my unit was not only there, but it was in charge of that facility at the time. And here's where I get past and present tense mixed up. My former unit, so I showed up wearing civilian clothes. I had to learn how to dress myself again because Uncle Sam gives you all your clothes when you're a soldier, but then he says that you can't dress like a soldier when you go in as media. So I had to make sure that I was wearing plaid and all sorts of things. I get there, I am jet lagged out of my tiny little mind. I am trying to keep a low profile until I can kind of get reoriented. And instead, somebody makes eye contact with me from my old unit, says, "Here he is," grabs me, takes me upstairs in the Pink Palace where the unit was headquartered, and throws me in front of my former brigade commander. I also served with him when he was my battalion commander, but I've got this a man that I respect very much, fear at least a little bit. Mm-hmm. He's in command of 3,000, of my fellow Iowans. Again, jet lagged out of my tiny little mind. I'm not quite sure how to react. I don't salute anymore because I'm not a soldier. And in fact, I don't want to insult the man by throwing him a salute when that's not necessarily appropriate. And what does he do? He up and gives me a hug. And friends who were present later related to me that I looked like a deer in the headlights, that I froze up like a piece of lumber, that I really didn't know what to do, what the appropriate response was. Then fast forward a couple of months when I'm at that veterans literature writing workshop, and I am still, thinking about it at night, thinking about it, over my breakfast or whatever, trying to figure out what that one tiny little moment meant. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly that was a generative, that was sand in my oyster that, created a poem from that. Never had the courage to ask him what he thought of that poem because I'm pretty sure he's seen it by now. But that tiny little moment, and so finding those fragments in my experience that I'm not quite sure what it meant, what to do with it. It's not going to be that moment is not going to be a chapter in my eventual book. Mm-hmm. That moment is not going to be worthy of even a flash essay. But it is certainly something that I can come at in any number of ways as a poem, mm-hmm. and then see what the readers get from it as well. Because sometimes the readers are the ones who are most able to interpret what something means.
Yeah, so. Awesome. Thank you. That was so visual too. I can really see it.
I'm talking an awful lot with my hands. I don't know whether I'm on a camera here. I could always.
Yeah, I do the same.
I find myself doing.
We can see your shoulders moving. So last question here, and then we'll wrap it up. And I forgot to say, I think people have figured out already, but we are talking today from Central Iowa.
Yes, we are.
I am curious about what you're reading. So a book you read recently that rocked your world. Let's end by celebrating another author's work. Excellent.
Glad to do so. I have just recently read for review and haven't yet to publish the review, but maybe you'll beat me to press with this video. Barry Alexander's On Afghanistan's Plains. And Barry was a British nursing officer. And so from my perspective, it's interesting to compare and contrast how different militaries work, and in fact, even how different National Guards work, because he has some experiences as a UK citizen soldier to my American one. But apparently a nursing officer is somewhere between medic and doctor. I mean, he speaks to the Afghanistan experience, southern Afghanistan particularly, from a number of vantages. So he's on the front lines with people doing patrols, but he's also back in the clinics. He's also on he's from the front line to the FOB. So obviously, I'm right there with him as a fellow FOB person. Forward
operating base for those
exactly. And we can go into a bonus round about why I did the glossary too. So like me, he had a number of different vantages on the battlefield. And I was surprised that at the end of his book, he then talked about a couple of poems that he had written and published previously. And in fact, I realized with that chapter, the big reveal was I had previously read his book in an anthology of contemporary war poets that was published in the UK. And I should have realized that On Afghanistan's Plains was a Kipling quotation. So he brought it all there for me. He kind of kept it a secret throughout this great nonfiction book that tells of his experiences and those of his mates. And then at the end, he ties it all together in this big literary poetic bow. And so certainly would encourage anybody out there to check out his work. It's just recently published a couple of months ago.
Awesome. Say the title and the author one more time.
That's Barry Alexander's On Afghanistan's Plains.
Okay, great. And we've been talking to Randy Brown, a.k.a. Charlie Sherpa. Welcome to FOB Haiku. You can order it online. Check out his website, Red Bull Rising, as well. And thank you so much for your time today.
Excellent. Have a great one, Katie. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah.